We're back. Oh, yes, the Airline Videos Live Plane Jockeys podcast back. Once again, I am Plane Jockey Kevin alongside Plane Jockey Rudy.
Hello, everybody. It's so good to finally be back for the Plane Jockeys podcast.
Oh, yes, and absolutely. And today we have the man you've all been waiting to hear from, Mr. Tater.
Howdy, y'all.
All right. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned.
From the flight deck, this is the Plane Jockeys Podcast, where we dig into some of the stories and personalities you've seen on Airline Videos Live. Our estimated time en route is, well, however long these guys want to chat. Now sit back and relax and enjoy the show. It's a lot more fun than reading the safety card. I promise.
Oh, yes, we're back once again. Welcome back to the Airline Videos Live Plane Jockeys podcast. Oh, did you miss us? Don't answer that. Of course you did, of course. How are you, Rudy?
Doing excellent. I have been looking forward to this podcast recording. Everyone is anxiously waiting to hear from the man himself, Tater.
Oh, yes, and we are outside the In-N-Out Burger where the planes fly right over our head. All right. The man himself, Mr. Tater. Hello.
Tater. Tater. How y'all doing?
Doing well. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Plane Jockeys podcast. You showed up today and you were like,
you
really?
Surprised.
Really? You want to do the podcast here?
Yes.
What are you thinking? It's cold, it's windy, the planes, it's loud, it's smelly, it's everything, right?
Yeah. Well, there you go. You know,
This is where it's at.
This is where it's at. I mean, we're not even given the whiff of In-N-Out.
No onions.
Not
no
today.
onions
No
today.
onions. No, we get burned rubber and jet fuel. So come on down.
Well, we love that just as much, right?
Oh, yes. Yes.
All right. Mr. Tater, so some people are going to tune in today and they're going to be like, I'm sorry, did Kevin say Tater? What in the world is that? Can you tell us who you are, Tater?
Howdy. I am an air traffic controller here at LAX Tower and have been for quite a little while.
Yeah.
I guess about 20 years off and on. At LAX, I've got 31 years total.
Yeah.
So I've nearly hit the end of my sentence. I might even get time off for good behavior.
Oh.
But you never know. But, yeah, I am actually... Well, let's start off right quick by clarifying who air traffic controllers work for in this country, because a lot of times I'll tell somebody I'm a controller, and either I get one of two responses. Oh, that's such a stressful job. I can never do that.
Yeah.
Or, oh, you're the guy with the orange batons.
Oh, really?
Question number two is normally, what airline do you work for? And in the U.S.,
It's a Delta A321neo flying over us.
in the United States, nearly all air traffic controllers work for the federal government.
Right.
Some are military or Department of Defense. The vast majority work for the Federal Aviation Administration. And this seems like a good time to mention that I am here speaking on my own today. I am not an official spokesperson for the Federal Aviation Administration or the Department of Transportation or Los Angeles World Airports or the National Air Traffic Controllers Association.
Right.
So everything I say here is my well thought out, well-reasoned opinion.
Yes.
And, but as such, most air traffic controllers in this country, like I said, work for the Federal Aviation Administration. There's about, give or take, 15,000 of us.
Wow.
And some of you may recall that back in 1981, there was a little fracas where the President Reagan at the time fired most of the controllers because they went on strike. And one of the minor details of being an air traffic controller in this country is we do not actually have the legal right to strike. And so they were given like 48 hours notice, come back to work or don't come back at all. And about 11,000 did not come back at all.
Wow.
It took about a decade to replace those guys.
Wow.
Mostly guys, a few gals, but it was not as integrated with them as it is now.
Right.
Hello, Alaska.
Are you feeling better about this location?
Well, yes, because my back is to the wind now. But I was in the very last class of strike replacements.
Oh, wow.
When my class finished a phase, they shut the academy down, and they didn't hire anybody for about 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
And so I have been, for most of my career, the very bottom of the totem pole in seniority, because it's just like the airlines. It's seniority based. What's your we call it service comp date. When was your first day with the government? And it's only been the last 10 or 12 years where I've been above the bottom third. Oh. And the crazy thing is, I'm less than a year from retirement. I'm still not number one.
Oh my gosh.
There's
Wow.
somebody with more seniority than me.
Amazing.
So, yeah. But the crazy thing is that this is not a job I ever would have guessed I'd end up doing. I trained to be a pilot after not making it as a veterinarian and after not making it as a musician.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
So, but I had the misfortune timing to finish my pilot training in around 1990, when one of the earlier economic downturns where all the airlines were basically going under or laying off people or both.
Right.
And so I went through a special college program that essentially guaranteed you an interview if you did all the things and kept a GPA and so forth. Got there, got the interview, and they say, hey, we like you. We're going to put you on this list, and we may call you someday.
Wow.
And you can't pay a lot of bills that way. So I went on and was doing some other stuff, still flying a little bit, but was driving a truck, running a Boy Scout camp, like you do. And my brother and a friend of ours have been researching, what it actually took during those days to become a controller. And at that time, the whole process started by taking a civil service exam. It was an exam you came in and you sat. It was about 4 hours. And there were study guides and all this stuff. They had gone to seminars on how to study for the test, how to take the test, what was going to happen after you took the test, and all this stuff. And test day comes around, and they say, hey, you fly, you should go do this. And then afterwards, we'll go lunch. It's like, okay, what are we having for lunch? So 4.5 hours later, we had barbecue.
Oh, good choice.
Yes. And I was like, okay, I got barbecue out of the deal.
And what state is this in?
This was in Texas.
Okay.
I'm from Houston originally. Still have family there. A great place to be from. But we did that, and it's a neat test. It's and I don't think they even do this anymore. The way you become a controller now is completely different than how it was then. But at the time, you took this test, and it was broken down into a whole bunch of sections. And each section was timed. You had however long to complete that section, and then they called time, and you moved on to the next section. If you didn't finish, too bad. If you finished early, you could not go ahead. So you have 10 minutes to do this section, and there's 100 problems or 100 questions or 10 questions or whatever it was. And it's a lot of it was like logic and reasoning type stuff. They give you a sequence of a dozen letters. What were the next two? Or they'd show you this weird geometric thing. Is okay, before we stepped on it, what was this? If you folded this up, what would it make? It's a tetrahedron or, some sort of D&D die or something. And there were some basic sort of map reading type problems and some diagrams where they show you basically a line, kind of like a road map, except they're theoretically airways, and various targets. And it's like, okay, target A is doing this, target B is doing this, target C, D, so forth. And then, which two targets are going to conflict. And the key to that was not figuring out which two were going to conflict. The key to that was looking at the answers and figuring out which one were the answers, because there were more than one that were going to conflict, but you couldn't choose that one. And so if you spent a lot of time doing that, you would never finish.
Oh my gosh.
So a bunch of that stuff. Anyway, did all that, walked out of there, didn't give it another thought. Ended up getting like a 94 on this stupid test.
Wow.
Yeah. And they were pissed.
Is that out of 100?
That's out of 100.
Oh, okay.
Passing was considered 70. But they had been told in one of their study seminars that if you didn't make at least 90 by this point in the process, this would have been 1990 or 91, I forget now, but they had nearly filled up the pipeline at that point. And so they had been told, if you didn't make at least about a 90, you probably were not going to get considered.
Uh-huh.
And so my brother made I don't remember, one of them got like a 69 and the other one got a 72. I forget which was which. But
and you have a 94, and
I have a 90. Well, I have a
Wow.
94, and I didn't care.
but you said that they were not pleased by that.
Well, my brother and our friend, the ones who,
Yeah.
they had actually wanted to go out and do this.
Ah.
I had done it just because we were going to go have barbecue after. That was my sole interest at the time. And so, yeah, they was like, oh, man, So, but even then, from the time I did that, it was over a year before I actually became a federal employee.
Oh.
Because
Wow.
there's so many steps along the way. You take the test, and then like a month, 6 weeks, 2 months later, I got this big envelope in the mail. It's a 13-page application in triplicate. Every place I'd ever worked, every place I'd ever gone to school, every place I'd ever lived, all kinds of other stuff. And they wanted real live references for all of this stuff.
Wow.
And it's the one job I've ever had where I know they checked up on the references, because I would hear back years later, oh, yeah, we got a call, we got a letter, we got a visit.
Wow. A visit. Wow.
Yeah. So
This was serious at
Yeah,
that point.
it's serious.
Yeah.
Don't know if that's still how they do it or not, but at the time, and it's like, man, if I really want to do this, filling out 13 pages in triplicate.
Yeah.
But I figured, well, I got nothing to lose, so I'll just keep going and we'll see where this goes. Did all that, and it was another month, 2 months before I got, before I heard back, and they said, okay, we want you to report for a physical at, such and such a time. Actually, no. First, it was an interview. I had to go up to Houston Center, which from where I was living at the time was clear across town. Houston Center is on the edge of Houston Intercontinental Airport on the north side of Houston. And so went up there to, have an interview. And the interview basically consisted of me meeting, whatever supervisor was on duty at the time. And we basically perched on corners of a break room table and chatted for 15, 20 minutes. Serious interview this was not. But I guess it's like, okay, we're going to make sure there's actually a real person doing this stuff,
Right.
get a feel. And then it was another month or 6 weeks after that, they sent me a letter or something saying, okay, physical. We need you to report to such and such clinic, it's, day and time for a physical. And most thorough physical I've ever had. Treadmill and the heart monitor, all the things. More thorough than any of my pilot physicals had been.
I was just going to say, I had visions of like being an astronaut.
It wasn't quite as bad as what they show you in the movie Right Stuff. I didn't have to sit there and blow bubbles and keep the ping pong ball afloat for 3 minutes or whatever it was.
Right.
But But yeah, the whole thing, drug test and blood test and then crickets for 2, 3, 4 months.
Wow.
And so, well, so much for that. And then out of the blue, a letter shows up saying, please report to, FAA training headquarters in Oklahoma City, January such and such, room this and, building this, room that. And so it's like, well, okay, I guess here we go. And at the time, still didn't realize that, this was the end of the line. And so chill up there. And it wasn't, I was there for 5, 6 months. And it was a couple of months in before I realized, holy cow, I nearly didn't make this because they were wrapping it all up. But at that time, you got to Oklahoma City, still there, the Mike Monroney FAA Center, I forget exactly what the rest of it's called, but you went through what they called the screen. They put you in a classroom for a week or two, and you basically got a cram course in, okay, this is what airplanes are, this is what they do, this is, some basic rudimentary air traffic control rules. And then we went into the lab, and the labs were set up as non-radar en route air traffic control, how airplanes were separated basically in the 1940s, 50s, before we had radar across the country where you could see all the airplanes. And so the first thing you had done in classroom is you had learned a map. They gave you this chart that's about half the size of the top of this table. And you had to be able, by Friday of that week, you showed up on Monday, by Friday you had to draw that thing from memory.
Wow.
Oh.
And so they gave you as many blanks as you wanted. And so everybody went home, you have it, stuck up on your bathroom wall, you have it in the kitchen, wherever. And everybody, you were practicing drawing this map over and over and over again.
Wow.
Because you had to know all the airways, the radials, the distances, the actual compass headings. It's not headings, but the actual radials were, okay, this is the such and such 315 radial, the angles between that radial and the one next to it, the frequencies for all the various facilities involved, the minimum altitude on these things, intersections along the way. And the reason you had to know all this is because once you were in the lab, that was the map you were using for all the lab problems.
Yeah.
And it's this basically fictional, chart that's kind of sort of modeled over, the central United States, and we called it Aero Center. And there was a Tulsa, and there was an Oklahoma City and stuff, but it didn't necessarily bear any, it wasn't real. But it was place names that were at least vaguely familiar. And we started running lab problems. And the lab problems were en route air traffic control, where you have a clock and you had flight plan strips for every flight in the problem. And you got about 5 minutes before the problem started where you got to sort your strips, because you had to put the strips in the right place or else it would make no sense once you actually started working. So you had basically a header for each navigational fix, and you had strips for the airplanes as they crossed over that fix, essentially. And so you had about 5 minutes to sort them and put them where they need to be and kind of review the problem. You couldn't make any notes, and then the instructor would start the clock, and for the next 30 minutes you were controlling airplanes. Meanwhile, the other half of the class, because they broke us broke the class in half for this, half of you were running the problem. The other half were what we call remotes, where you're sitting on the other side of the room with, a microphone and a headset and a script. And you're looking at the same clock, and at 5 minutes into the problem, you act like TWA 237 requesting a higher altitude. And at 7 minutes into the problem, you act like, McAllister Tower requesting an IFR release on Cessna 22 poo-poo, and so forth. And
I'm listening to you. I'm listening to this. Is this kind of, you like this kind of stuff? You like these challenges in life? I'm getting a sense of that.
Taste.
It is yes, because I'm sitting here and my anxiety is through the roof.
Yeah, it sounds very stressful.
Well, it is very stressful, and because you did this for 8 hours a day for weeks. You ran practice problems for the first week or two, basically to learn how, and all these problems, of course, are orchestrated, where there's conflictions built in. The whole point is that stuff's going to happen, and you've got to see it coming.
Right.
And sometimes the more advanced problems, basically the moment the clock starts, you need to be ready to say something, because there are two airplanes wired for sound at like 10 minutes and 30 seconds into this problem. And so if you don't, say, both, the moment the clock starts, if you don't issue some sort of control instruction to fix that, then, it's too late, essentially, because at that time, the airplanes have what we call a 10-minute push. So when you have an airplane that's projected to be at such and such a place at such and such a time, that spot at that time, at that altitude, needed to be open 10 minutes before he got there, just to make sure that nothing else was there. Right. And so that's why I say, at 10 minutes and 30 seconds, something's going to happen.
Yeah.
And of course, there's all sorts of things built in, and the whole time there's a tape running. So, Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was a cassette tape recorder that you would put your tape in, and it was tied to the clocks. So when they started the clocks, the tape started recording. And then, at the end of the problem, the remote got to go on break. The student got to rewind the tape, and the instructor, and they basically played it all the way through again, and the instructor saying, well, this is where you should have done this, that, and the other thing. And, this is where, and he's sitting there keeping track.
Right.
And depending on what kind of mistake you made, there were some number of points taken off. If you had 2 airplanes run together, that was minus 15 points. But you couldn't have more than, I think, 3 of those in one problem. If you had 4, the 4th one was basically for free. And there were errors like, okay, you gave the right instruction, but it's physically impossible for the airplane to do that. So that's like minus 5 points. But we'll pretend that it actually happened.
Yeah.
And so you could sometimes try and keep track as you're going. It's like, okay, I screwed that up. Those are worth 20 points. But at this point, I've capped out on that kind of mistake. So I can make that mistake again, and it doesn't count anymore because I've already gotten as many hits on that as as they can give me. But I want to avoid making this other mistake. So you would say, okay, well, I'm going to make this mistake or issue this impossible control instruction because it will keep me from getting dinged on this other category where I could still take another hit.
But at this point, are you guaranteed a job at this point?
No. No.
So this is all just kind of like seeing if you got it.
This is seeing if you got it.
Okay.
And
Well, I was going to ask at that point, did you kind of question, like, what did I get myself into?
Yeah. Every day. Well, because it got to the point that you're doing this nonstop. And so you do it, and we would alternate. You would run a problem, and then you would go and you would be remote for your partner, who would then run a problem. And then you'd swap, and you'd do it again and again. And you usually would end up running 2 or 3 problems each day. And then they would give you extra, you could have extra sets of strips where you and study partners could go and run more on your own at home. And you were strongly encouraged to do that.
Yeah.
You were strongly encouraged not to bring your family or anybody with you. It's like, you're going to be here, and this is total immersion. You don't have time for anything else. You're in Oklahoma City. There's nothing to do anyway. I'm sorry,
Oklahoma City.
I'm sorry, Oklahoma City, but this was 1992, so there wasn't quite as much there then as there was a blacksmithing school, because at one point I went and looked into that when things were looking a little dim. But
how long was this whole process? How
this
long were you
whole thing ran for like 9 weeks.
9 weeks, okay.
And I do remember on like day 1 or day 2 of the class, when we're still in the classroom, the instructor saying, look to your left, look to your right. By it, before we're done with this, at least one of those people won't be here.
Yeah.
And if they are, then it's you. My class of 19, they broke us down into smaller classes, but my class of 19, 7 of us made it.
Wow.
And there were some classes that weren't, there were some classes that had nobody make it.
Wow.
Sounds like boot camp for...
Yeah, it kind of is, except we didn't have to do push-ups.
Yeah.
But what they did do is every time we had a test or a graded problem, you got a new breakdown of what your situation was, where your score was, because you had to finish this entire thing. It's still a government program, so you have to finish it with at least a 70. 70 is almost always the bare minimum for government tests.
Right.
And I remember about halfway through the graded problems, which started, like I said, about 2 weeks once we got into the lab, the guy on my left could have died, and it wouldn't have mattered. He still would have made it. He aced everything. It was disgusting.
Wow.
About the same time, the guy on my right could have started acing everything, and it wouldn't have mattered. He was numerically illuminated.
Wow. So Delta 767.
Yeah, nice 300.
Yes.
But the funny thing is they didn't make you leave. You got to stay. And, you were on salary, so, there was no incentive for him to leave, even though he knew, I'm not going to make it. But I'm going to stick it out for the other, 4 or 5 weeks because I'm on salary.
Right.
Why not, And they don't do it that way now because it costs a hideous amount of money to do it this way. It just had to. And then at the end of all of that, there was a final exam. And the day before the final exam, the instructor came around and gave each of us basically another grade sheet, if you will, showing, okay, this is what your standing is in the class right now, and if you needed it, this is the bare minimum score you need to make on that final exam in order to pass.
Ugh.
No pressure.
Oh.
I needed a 70.4 to pass. 70.4 was not a score you could make because of the number of problems. You could make a 70.2 or you could make a 70.6.
Oh.
Yeah. And actually I got that wrong. I needed a 0.2 and 0.2 was not a score you could make. It was either 0.4 or 69.8. So there's no margin for error.
Yeah.
And my brother called and said, hey, I want to come see you graduate. And I said, well, you may see me graduate. You may help me pack. And I don't know which one it's going to be when you get here.
Oh, that's terrifying.
And it is, because the day you got your grade sheets was the day that everything happened, because we were done with lab problems. We were done with all that. You got your grade sheet, and then we went through follow-on to determine, what was going to happen next, or you got out processed, and by lunch you were unemployed.
Oh my
Wow.
goodness.
Yeah. And so, and he had to drive up from Houston to Oklahoma City, which is a long day's drive.
Yeah.
And he got in late, that night. Oh, and it was over the weekend where we took the test on Friday. We got the grades back on Monday.
Oh,
and all of a
long
sudden,
weekend.
after 2 months
Yeah.
of just nonstop studying and the lab problems, where you're doing lab problems so much that you're dreaming about lab problems. I mean, at times it's like, I don't know if I'm awake or I'm asleep.
Right.
It's that intense. And then all of a sudden, you're in Oklahoma City with nothing to do for 2 whole days. I mean, there's no study groups. There's nothing. Obviously, it's like, what do I do now? And he got in late Sunday night. I still don't know, what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And this is back before cell phones. So,
Oh.
Next day I go to work, and I still, go to work. I go to, class. Still don't know. Is he going to get to see me graduate, or is he going to help me pack? And so anyway, I got like a 70.4 or whatever it took. I mean, one question either way.
Wow.
And which is crazy.
Yeah.
And
How did you feel when you got that score? I mean, after all that.
relieved? Partly just because it's over.
Yeah.
And partly because, well, at least, now I don't have to go home yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was because there was somebody in my class who was basically same situation and had the 69.8.
Oh.
And at that point, and there's a process where you could try and retake something.
Yeah, I was going to ask, yeah.
If there's some, I was sick that day or whatever. Don't know what ended up happening. But, there were a lot of people at home that day. And, but the thing is, you think about it, and every step of this process basically weeds out people. First is at that time, the written exam. There's something comparable now, I think. But then the physical, the interview, now there's basically a psychological profile type thing that, one of these things where they ask you an impossible question, and you want impossible answer A or impossible answer B, and how you get something useful out of that, I don't know, but that's part of the process. And then you get to whatever your first facility is going to be. In my case, that was Monroe, Louisiana. I didn't choose it.
Yeah. Were they just pulling, names of cities out of a hat, or?
I assumed there was a system where facilities that had openings would be assigned trainees.
Okay.
Those who graduated at the top of the class got to choose. Those of us at the bottom of the class got whatever was left over.
Right.
And so
there was a need in Monroe at the time.
Yeah.
Well, and that was where I nearly pulled the plug, because I had been to Monroe, Louisiana before, and just to be clear, it is Monroe, not Monroe. Monroe is in Wisconsin.
Ah, got it.
Monroe is in Louisiana.
I should know. My brother went
Yeah.
to school there, but of course I'm still pronouncing it incorrectly.
Well,
Monroe.
I mean, like you do, but
So you were willing to just walk away from everything that you've been through for that last 9 weeks?
because
Wow.
I didn't want to move to
Oh my
Monroe,
gosh.
Louisiana. But it's like, well, I don't really have any better, anything better going, so why not?
Yeah.
And I can always get there and pull the plug later. And so I went. And Monroe, it's a hard place. As a newcomer, is not a particularly friendly place to be. It's a small town that's kind of just gotten big. Sidetrack. In aviation, Monroe's claim to fame is that it's the birthplace of Delta Airlines. Which originally started off as Duff Holland, I think, dusters. Delta Airlines originally started as a crop dusting service.
Right.
Lots of cotton and soybean and stuff in that area. But great place to raise a kid. Not a really exciting town. It is a college town, but it's a great place to learn how to be an air traffic controller. Monroe is, I believe it still is, what we call an up-down, where it's not just a control tower, it's also got a radar room, approach control.
Okay.
So you would go up and learn how to work the control tower, and then you would go downstairs and learn how to work approach control, and which is a neat thing that we don't have here at LAX. At LAX, you're in the tower, and that's where you are. The approach control is 100 miles away in San Diego. But it's a nice thing to be in an up-down because you know what's going to happen when you tell the airplane to contact departure or contact tower, because you're also familiar with what those other controllers are doing.
Right.
And whereas here, that's been lost. On the other hand, there's no way we could keep 100 and some odd controllers current in the tower if they also had to work the radar room, which is part of why it's been split. But so I went to Monroe, spent about 4 years there, ended up liking it by the time I left, and went from there to New Orleans. The big airport in New Orleans. At the time, Moisant Field, now the Louis B. Armstrong Memorial Airport, I believe is what they call it. And spent about 6 years there before coming out here to LAX, and have been at LAX most of the time since. I went and did a quick touch and go in Memphis in 2005, 6, 7-ish, and that didn't go as well as hoped, and ended up coming back to LAX, and they've been stuck with me ever since.
So do you start at a smaller airport and kind of work yourself up to like a size of LAX? Is that how it works?
Yes, it's just like pilots in that regard. That you start out in a Piper or a Cherokee or a Cessna or whatever, and you work your way up. LAX is a horrible place to try and learn how to be an air traffic controller, and we've tried. It did not turn out well.
Yeah.
We were, but there was a period where the agency tried hiring people off the street because we have an impending staff shortage, and it's like, we're just going to hire a bunch of people and throw them out there and see what sticks.
Yeah.
And a few of them, there was potential in a few of them. And some of them, the ones that had potential, we were able to salvage and send to, neighboring airports, Santa Monica, Torrance, El Monte, Van Nuys, and some of them come back.
Okay. I was just going to ask you. So, someone working in Van Nuys, do they see the feature of working at LAX? Is that something
that I think for some of them it is?
Yeah.
Some of them come and visit and realize they don't want to.
Yeah.
But we've got a fair number of controllers at LAX now who at one point were at Van Nuys earlier in their career. When I got to LAX, my primary instructor had previously been at Van Nuys. Van Nuys has parallel runways,
Right.
which LAX has as well.
Right.
And so there are things you learn doing that.
Right.
But whereas like Santa Monica, there's only one runway. At one point, it was the busiest single runway airport in the world.
Wow.
I don't think it is anymore since they shortened the runway,
Right.
but still a busy little airport. In the last 4 or 5 years, it's going to be around, it sounds like.
Right.
But
And you guys still have to deal with it, because I hear you guys.
do.
Oh wait, hold on, you're not going anywhere. We got to wait for Santa Monica.
well, if you look at the chart, you can see that the airport runways at LAX and the runway at Santa Monica, you draw a straight line out from our runways and their runway, and they eventually cross.
Oh, wow.
And the noise abatement restrictions at Santa Monica are such that an airplane taking off there cannot turn away from our traffic until it's out over the water.
Okay.
And so because of that, there's no guarantee that their airplane will be separated from ours. And so LAX Tower actually controls the release of airplanes out of Santa Monica. Now, the VFR guys in the pattern, they're on their own. Santa Monica Tower works that. But an airplane that's departing on an IFR flight plan into the National Airspace System has to be separated from all the other ones. And that's how we handle that converging situation, is that LAX Tower will build a hole in our departure sequence, and we'll call over to Santa Monica and say, Santa Monica, Cessna 22 poo-poo released. And at that point, I'm stopped. And you've probably seen sometimes where I've got a line of airplanes sitting over here, and
Yeah. Yeah.
nothing going on here, because I'm waiting for something to happen offshore where I can't I can't start departing airplanes again until the Santa Monica airplane is out of the way, essentially.
Right.
And because of the terrain north of Santa Monica, they can't turn northbound until they're out of about 3,000 feet. And the little Cherokees and Cessnas and stuff, it takes them several minutes to get there.
Right.
And so, we end up waiting. The Learjets and so forth, well, they don't get many Learjets anymore, but, the jets and the turboprops aren't so bad. It's the little guys that kind of slow things down. And so sometimes the little guy kind of sits there at Santa Monica cooling his heels for quite a while.
Right.
Before, we can find a convenient spot where it's not going to completely hose 1,000 passengers.
Right.
While the training flight goes out.
Right.
So, but
Yeah, that's always
Yeah.
been a question. What's the holdup? Why are we waiting so long for these planes to depart? And so that would be one example.
that is one of the many reasons. Another reason is that some of it depends on where the planes are going. Because if you look at the runways at LAX are all parallel, basically. They're all about a 251 degree compass heading. They're called 2.5s and 2.4s just because if you have 3, you can do 2.5 left, right, and center. If you have 4, okay, so, for instance, Memphis has a 3.6 left, right, and center. But when you have 4, and you see the same thing at DFW, where, okay, you're going to have pairs. You can have a 2.5 left, 2.5 right, 2.4 left, 2.4 right.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the number doesn't exactly correspond to the compass heading, but it's close-ish.
Right.
And DFW has the same thing. Atlanta does the same thing.
Yeah.
Phoenix, lots of airports have something like that. And at LAX, we try to run the north side, the 2.4s, and the south side, the 2.5s, like separate airports, where the tower controller on the south side, what we call Local 1, works his airplanes independently of what the tower controller on the north side, which we call Local 2, is doing with his or her airplanes. But it depends on where the airplane's going to go once it's airborne, because you can look at the departure procedures. Some of them turn south,
Right.
some of them turn north.
Right.
And so the guys going south that are on the north side of the airport, so Southwest, for instance, is going to conflict with basically anything departing off the south side of the airport. And if you get northbounders on the south side, they're going to conflict with basically anything off the north side of the airport. And so there's a certain amount of what we call crossover coordination, where one of the locals calls the other one and says, hey, I've got a, fill in the blank, depending on what kind of departure procedure. Most of our departure procedures have names. I provided you guys with a couple of charts, but this is stuff that you can look up online. If you're interested in looking at the departure procedures or any of the other charts, you can go to airnav.com. That's AIRNAV.com. And it will ask you, and you select the airports tab and then put in LAX. And you can pull up every single, approach plate. That's the instrument approaches. You can look at all the instrument departures. You can see the official description of all the runways, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
So that's all available publicly.
So one example, though, we see this a lot. I'll just take the Tokyo-Haneda routes.
Okay.
A lot of airlines now go there.
Yep.
There's a Delta A330neo who is on the north side, sometimes takes off on 24 left, more than enough takes off sometimes on 25 left, 25 right, but then you'll see another flight going to Tokyo Haneda on the southern side, and then they'll go up to 24 left on the north side and take off. So they're going to the same destination, but people, the flights are either going north or
they're not
south.
always going to the runway closest to them. Yes.
Right.
Some of that depends on what route they filed to get out of here.
Okay.
And sometimes it comes down to the aircraft performance. You'll have, and you'll hear this a lot in the summer on ground control, where you'll have somebody on the north side particularly, but Haneda is one of the primary offenders, where you'll have a departure tell the ground controller, we require 25 right for operational necessity.
Right.
For aircraft performance, because the 25s are longer than the 24s.
Right.
That's, if I could change something at this airport, I wish all the runways were the same length, because that would simplify things a lot.
Yeah.
But they're not. And so there are times that they need the extra couple thousand feet that 25 right offers over what you can get on 24 left.
Okay.
And so, yes, they should be on the north side of the airport, but they can't do it because the plane's too heavy, or the wind's not favorable, or the temperature, or all of the above. And so they go to the south side. That's why, and I've seen it too, where you've got the Delta that ends up going to 25 right.
And sometimes 25 left and crosses the runways. We can never figure that out.
Yeah, that's kind of an oddball. Normally they go to 25 left if there's something wrong with 25 right. And now the exception to that is if it's a 747-800 or a 380.
Right.
Because 25 right is not usable by either of those airplanes, because the wingspan is just too great. They're going to get too close to something else. And so they'll go to 25 left. Not what we like to do with that airplane, because it's a lot of bother, honestly.
Yeah.
Because what happens is when the 380, we'll say, because that's easier, crosses 25 right on his way to get to 25 left. If he can't cross both runways at the same time, he'll give an instruction, like Emirates, 12 Echo, because that seems to be one of their call signs now. It's actually leave across runway 25 right, hold short runway 25 left. So he can cross 25 right, but he cannot cross 25 left. And there's lines on the ground where they're supposed to stop.
Right.
And normally, when we do that, most of us are trying to time it so that I don't actually have to make him stop.
Okay.
Because the entire time he's holding short of 25 left, having just crossed 25 right, he's not actually clear of 25 right. So I've lost the use of runway 25 right while he's holding in between, because the airplane's just too big. And so my goal doing that normally is that I'm going to start him across with the intent that before he has to stop, I'll be able to continue him across 25 left.
Right.
Sometimes it doesn't work out that way, where I'm normally waiting for an arrival to clear the runway.
Right.
If they don't get off, or they slow down on final, on the whole, whatever, sometimes I can't do it, and he ends up having to stop. And the challenge is that taxiway hotel, which is the taxiway between the 25s, is not at the same level as the runways. It's actually lower, and that's by design.
Really? Wow.
But what it means is that he's sitting there short of 25 left in between the runways. it's uphill for him to get going to then cross 25 left. And it takes, something like a 380, it takes a lot of power to, a lot of what they call breakaway thrust to get that thing moving again. And if he's stationary, as a controller, I'm sitting there looking at the hole between arrivals that I'm trying to get him across. And so, if the arrivals are running kind of tight on the final, I may not be able to get him across. But I don't want to get him started until, I'm fairly certain I'm going to make it, because once he starts, I've lost the inboard, 25 right. And I can't get him across 25 left. Well, I'm basically stopped. But then once we get him over on, the other side, he's on taxiway alpha, he's taxiing his way down. There are new rules that come into effect where if I've got two 380s, they both have to be at the departure end of the runway. So if I've got a 380 land and turns off on the taxiway alpha, I can't launch another 380 until the first one is basically back up to the other end of the runway, because there just isn't enough wingtip clearance once the thing is going, 100 miles an hour down the runway. And that also applies to 747-800s.
Right.
And that's a trap at this airport, because you put a 380 on the runway, or you put a 747-800 on 25 left. If the ground controller is not really paying attention, we have 747-800s that park in the cargo ramp. Korean, Nippon Cargo, sometimes Polar will be parked along taxiway alpha there.
Right.
And if you push one of those airplanes on the taxiway alpha, now I can't depart the first one, because those, the second one is too far down the runway. And but the other thing you have to worry about is just that, okay, I'm going to depart this 380. I need a hole between arrivals on final where I can get him out there on the runway and get him to go. And, you've seen those airplanes. They don't do anything fast. That's over 1 million pounds of airplane. And if he had to go 25 left, it's because he's really heavy, or it's really hot, or both. And so nothing happens fast. But while he's not doing anything fast, everybody else is at normal speed. And even they slow down to 120 miles an hour on the final, that's still 2 miles a minute. And there's an awful lot of planes at this airport that cannot go that slow. So you sit there because I need a hole. And sometimes we actually have to call approach control and say, hey, I need you to build me a hole so I can get this guy out. And sometimes that takes a while, because they've got a solid line all the way back to the state line. And, so that's why we don't like them over there.
You don't like the A380s? You kind of touched on that on our, when you came by and said hello a few months ago.
The 380 doesn't really fit at this airport. One of the things that I've shared with y'all is the list of restrictions that apply to the 380 or the 747-800, although the 380 is worse, as far as where I can go and where I cannot go with that airplane. And it's a lot. And they just don't fit. I mean, this airport was built for stuff the size of a 727. And the 380, there's not many airports that can handle a 380, and we just barely can.
So why all of us plane spotters are like, yes, more A380s back at LAX. Later, Tater is over here going, no.
Well, and I just saw a headline where we are going to be one of the most diverse 380 spotting airports in the world.
Really? Wow.
We've got currently, I think, 5 carriers. We've got Emirates, we've got Qantas, we've got Lufthansa is going to be bringing theirs back.
Yes.
British Airways, I think, is sort of seasonal. And
Korean Air, I think, is bringing back 2 daily.
We currently have Korean and Asiana, which is sort of interesting because they're becoming one company. I'm kind of curious what's going to happen there. But so we've got a fair, fair number of 380s. We used to have a few more, but China Southern has parked all of theirs. Air France has parked all of theirs.
Well, now everyone listening knows. Because one of the most asked questions to us is, why do the A380s always go to the north? Why can't they just come to the south?
Well, and arriving on the south side, if he lands on 25 left, that's not that big a deal. departing off of 25 left is a much bigger thing.
Yeah.
You're going to see that. I think I might have touched on this the other day when we were talking, but you're going to see that early next year because there's a bunch of construction planned from the north side of the airport where the airport is building some additional runway exits. And to do that, at some point, they will actually have to close the runway so that they can do the tie-in work. They're going to start with 24 left, I think is the one that closes first.
Okay.
Which is not that big a deal for departures because the 380 can't depart on 24 right anyway. So when 24 right closes, no big deal. When 24 left closes,
Right.
then all the 380 departures will have to go with 25 left because that's the only other runway.
Okay.
And 24 right is supposed to close kind of at the end of the summer.
Okay.
24 left closes basically early next year.
Okay. Jotting that down in my calendar.
Yeah, well, I may have told you wrong when we talked about it the other day. I've since actually seen sort of a revised calendar, and it's
still coming.
It's still coming.
Yeah.
So, this time next year, they will be or will have been on 25 left.
Okay.
And so, yeah, all the folks on the hill are going to get a good view.
Yes.
Yeah.
Looking
So
forward
now,
to that.
when the closures happen here on the north side, because we have an E-jet coming in.
Oh.
Yay!
Will they be able to conduct both landings, they meaning you guys, conduct both landings and departures on the same runway that is open?
Yes.
Okay.
We do that sometimes anyway. You've probably seen once a month, the airport will close one runway or another to do what we call the monthly inspections, where
Right.
they'll close the runways usually kind of middle of the afternoon, which is kind of the quietest part of the daylight hours. And they'll get out there with, a couple of dozen trucks and whatnot, and they're looking at all the lights. They're really inspecting all the expansion gaps to make sure that the rubber strips aren't coming up. Sometimes they'll touch up the paint. Sometimes they scrub the rubber off the runway, all that kind of stuff. And it normally is about an hour. But during that time, that runway's closed. They really don't like it when you land an airplane with vehicles on the runway. They get really upset about that. It's the funniest thing. But so we will be, it'll be a single runway operation on that side of the airport for the hour or however long it takes. And normally we coordinate with approach control, but they give us a little bit more space between the arrivals so that we can get out some of the departures. If there's a big line of departures forming, we may end up actually sending some of them to the other side of the airport.
Right.
So, there have been cases where you probably looked out there, it's like, what is Southwest doing over there? Well, Southwest is a southbounder and the runway's closed and there's like 10 other airplanes already waiting. So, there it goes.
Can I ask you, how rare is it that two planes would be landing at the same time, either on the 24s or the 25s? Is that a rare event here at LAX?
You mean whether 24 left and 24 right?
The exact same time. We've had it on the live stream, and I've caught
Yeah.
it while I was up at the H Hotel one day.
Okay.
It just caught me by surprise.
It is not that common anymore.
Yeah.
When I got to LAX, that was standard procedure.
Oh, okay.
And that was part of what made training here kind of challenging because there were times that we were landing all four runways.
Oh, wow.
And but you still had to get your departures out. And you still had to get the arrivals on the outboard runway across the inboard runway.
Jeez.
Good luck.
Well, and as a footnote to history, I hope at that time LAX led the nation in runway incursions, where there's an airplane or a vehicle on the runway when they're not supposed to be. One of the things we did to basically fix that is we got arrivals off of the inboards, particularly 25 right. 25 right is the worst arrival runway because the airplane exits the runway right into the terminal complex.
Right.
24 left, not so bad. They're, a mile and a half down there. But on the south side of the airport, they come off. I mean, you see where they exit normally.
Yeah.
Picture them exiting inboard runway at that position, and boom, they're right there at the terminal.
Yeah.
And as a ground controller, that stinks.
Yeah.
Because, the south side of the airport gets pretty busy. There's a lot of gates on the south side of the airport that have to push onto an active taxiway. That's the only place for that airplane to go. And so if you've tied up one of your taxiways pushing an airplane off the gate, you've only got one other taxiway left to move everybody else around. And here comes somebody off the arrival runway, smack dab in the middle of your pie. And yeah, so it's not fun. I don't really miss that.
Would you know if back then, were there just more flights that they could do that?
There were. LAX right now we're still down from our before time numbers. Before the pandemic, we would run easily 2,000 flights a day. Right now, we're getting almost back up to 1,700.
Okay.
But other stuff has changed since then. This was probably before you were watching on a regular basis. We used to have a lot more regional propeller planes. SkyWest flew Brazilias.
Oh.
American Eagle had Saab 340s. Before that, they had Jetstreams. And for a while, we had Horizon, still had Dash 8s or Q400.
Yeah.
Those are all gone now. And as a result, we have flights going places that we don't have flights going anymore because the jet can't get into that airport. Palomar, for instance, we used to have flights going down to Carlsbad. Carlsbad has a fairly short runway. And when SkyWest was flying to Brasilia, the Brasilia could do it.
Yeah.
RJ kind of sort of apparently is really runway restricted. And so they don't do it. They used to go to St. George, Utah. Don't do that anymore. A couple other places that when they parked the Brasilias, they quit serving those airports.
Interesting.
And but while they were doing that, we had a lot more flights to a lot more places with the regionals than what we have now. And so, yes, we were running more airplanes, but a lot of them were smaller airplanes.
Yeah, okay.
And, of course, now we've got 350s and
Singapore A350
yeah.
flying over our heads. Well, later, Tater, I think we're just getting started here.
Yeah.
What do you say?
So.
I think stay for a little bit more later.
Just a little
Tater?
bit longer.
Yes.
All right. Don't go anywhere. Much more to come here on the Plane Jockeys podcast. Welcome back.
Folks, again from the flight deck, we hope you're enjoying those luxurious seats and plentiful complimentary beverages. Oh, right, it's a podcast. Well, then we hope you're enjoying the banter. Stay tuned for more.
Oh, yes. So much more to the story, isn't there?
Oh, yes.
So,
Always.
later, Tater. So we're hearing that you've spent many time around the U.S., leading you back to Los Angeles a couple of times.
Yes.
And you decided to stay here.
Yes.
Why?
Well, let's see here. They asked me back. But honestly, this place, I mean, y'all watch the planes here. You've been to other places.
Yeah.
And DFW, you're going to see every airplane American owns. You go to Memphis, you're going to see every airplane FedEx owns. You go to Houston, you're going to see every airplane that United owns. LAX, you're going to see a whole smorgasbord of airplanes.
Yes.
There are airplanes that you can see here you can't really see anywhere else in the United States or in North America. We were talking about 380s earlier. At one point, we led the nation in 380s, and we had airlines that the only place they came in all of North America was LAX. And so there's just the amazing variety. No one airplane no one airline can call this a hub. I mean, some of them call it a focus city or something, but we're not dominated by any one airline, which is kind of unusual. We have Southwest, American, Delta, United, Spirit, JetBlue, Alaska, Hawaii, and a bunch of others, plus all the international carriers, but there's no one airline that owns this airport, so to speak. And so it just the sheer variety of paint schemes, aircraft type, it's hard to touch that. And I mean, face it, they pay me to to look out the window and talk to these airplanes. I mean,
But obviously,
you can't beat that.
Yeah, but you're in the aviation. You wanted to be a pilot. Are you considered a plane spotter or an av geek or any one of those titles?
An av geek, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't consider myself a plane spotter. That's my job.
Yeah.
Is to,
Right.
The American taxpayer pays me to look at these airplanes.
Right.
And,
That's a pretty cool gig.
Yeah.
it is. If you like airplanes, this is a great job.
Yeah.
The downside is that sometimes it's a neat airplane, but I've got to go do something else. I can't sit and look at that airplane because I need to talk to this other one, or I need to check the radar and see, what's going on, or talk to one of the other controllers, or look at flight plans, or do what I'm actually being paid to do.
Right.
And so there are times that, that was a cool plane. Geez, too bad I didn't actually get to see it.
I'm curious, do you have a favorite airplane or a type that you really like?
Wide bodies would be the TriStar, which is basically extinct at this point, which is kind of sad. They built them here in Southern California, up the road in Burbank. At
Palmdale, actually.
Actually, Palmdale is where Lockheed is now. Lockheed used to be in Burbank. Now it's a mall. You can drive by on the 5 and see all the airplanes on posts that used to be built there. But
the Empire Center, yes.
Yeah, they've got an SR-71, they've got a P-80, they've got a P-38. There's a Constellation, one of the most beautiful airplanes of all time.
Yeah.
And I think they've got a Lockheed Vega. I think it's actually the Winnie Mae. But and you can see all that from the 5 freeway. That used to be an airplane factory. All of Los Angeles used to be an airplane factory back in the day. I mean, they used to build airplanes in Downey.
Yeah.
And basically all we've got left now is Northrop over, south of LAX. And, of course, Robinson Helicopter is in Torrance. And I think they build more helicopters every year than any other helicopter manufacturer at this point. Wow. And they're everywhere. But yeah, as far as my favorite wide body, the TriStar.
Yeah.
It's sadly kind of lost out to the DC-10, which is now also rapidly becoming extinct. I think FedEx has parked all of theirs.
Yeah.
They were the last big DC-10 operator here. We still see MD-11s. FedEx still has some of those. They're going away, but they aren't gone yet. Somebody else operates.
Western Global,
Western
yes.
Global,
Yeah.
thank you. I think still has MD-11s. And that's about it. And those airplanes were also built in Long Beach, right down the road here. I mean, this whole area used to be one giant aircraft factory. And, of course, the real estate's too valuable now.
Right.
But
wow, so much history.
Oh, loads of history. Yeah. Well, and consider that this airport is nearly 100 years old. What is now LAX dates back to at least 1928. They held the national air races here in 1928.
It wouldn't be LAX without the sirens.
Without an ambulance, yes. We've been lucky, actually, so far.
Yeah.
Well, because there's a fire station just right over there.
Well,
there's
it's a busy
another
place.
one over there, and
Very busy place.
Very
LAX.
busy place. But yeah, this was originally Mines Field back in the 20s. It didn't. The city of Los Angeles didn't actually buy the airport until the late 30s because Depression. They needed a bond issue that the voters wouldn't approve because money. But airline service started here in 1946. Prior to that, it had been across town at Glendale or Burbank.
Right.
And
nice Delta A330neo.
Yeah. It's amazing how much quieter the newer airplanes are.
Yes.
I mean, compare that one to the old 330s.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Amazing amount of difference. A few weeks ago, flew Southwest back home and back. And on the way out was in an 800. On the way back was my first time in a MAX.
Oh.
And I was amazed. I mean, the passenger experience in the MAX, not that different from an 800, but it's a lot quieter.
Yeah.
I was really impressed at how much quieter the MAX was for, as a passenger.
Very nice.
And that was one of the things I remember when the 380 first showed up. Airbus brought their demonstrator through here back in the early 2000s. And I remember being surprised at how quiet that airplane is compared to think back at that point, we had 400s, which we don't have hardly any of them more, and we would still have 200s flying cargo.
Yeah.
Much noisier airplanes than the Airbus. The Airbus 380 is relatively a quiet airplane. It's amazing to see something that big moving at all, and the amount of noise that it doesn't make. I mean, I as a controller don't love that airplane, but it's amazing nonetheless to see it go. And it's kind of a shame that it was kind of commercially a failure.
Yeah.
I think Airbus ended up building, 250 some odd of those airplanes. And I do recall reading one point that the break-even point for that project was 400.
Oh.
So I don't know that, they ever actually made any money on it. But it was certainly a halo product for them. There were actually plans at one point for an even bigger version. There was going to be, the one we see now is the A380-800. There were plans, at least on paper, for a 900 that was going to be some amount longer than the one we see now.
Yeah.
Because you look at the one we have now, it's like, wow, it seems a little short for how big the rest of the airplane is.
Yeah.
And, it's like looking at a Dreamliner 800, or 8, I guess, 7, 8, and then look at a 9 or a 10, which, like, well, the proportions are better. But you look at one of the short Dreamliners, it's like, aren't you a little short for a Dreamliner?
I agree, yeah.
Can I ask you, though, you're sitting here and you're talking about the airplanes. Are most people that work in the tower, are they into aviation, or is it just a
some
a
of us
job-ish?
are,
Yeah.
and some it's a job.
Yeah.
The amount of aviation, at least interested folks at LAX, I would say somewhere between, let's call it 50%.
Okay.
The pilot population in the control tower is around 25-30% of us have some sort of pilot license or training or experience.
Okay.
We've got at least one CFI, a certified flight instructor. We've got at least one who is type rated in jets. I'm neither of those, but we've got a fair amount of pilot experience here. I don't know if that translates across the system. That said, every facility I've worked, a whopping total of 4, I was not the only pilot there. And in most cases, I was not even the most experienced pilot there. There was always a couple of other, pilots. Some of them active, some of them not. But, there are pilots in, I would say, most air traffic facilities at some level or another.
And I would imagine having that kind of experience definitely adds to your role as an air traffic controller.
It can, but one of the things I have to keep in mind, this is something that a lot of people, I think, I run into in the general public don't realize. I can't fly the plane. And this is something when I first reported to Monroe, and my first supervisor said, you can't fly the plane for them. When you're up here, you're a controller, and they do the pilot stuff, you do the controller stuff. And so, I'm aware of what's going on in the cockpit, but that's not my primary concern. I mean, that pilot is responsible for one airplane. I'm responsible for potentially a dozen. And so he does what I do. I don't tell him what to do with the flaps or that kind of stuff.
Right.
And he hopefully doesn't try and tell me what the sequence is supposed to be.
Right.
But
can you kind of describe what your day is like? So do you work like an 8-hour day, or is it like a 12-hour day? And you're kind of not. I mean, we hear you on the live streams. Sometimes you're in the North Tower, sometimes in your South Tower. You're doing ground. You're doing this. You're doing that. Can you kind of explain what a typical day at
it's
LAX?
A moving target. Well, and that's something that pretty much every air traffic control facility, all the controllers assigned to that facility will be cross-trained to do anything in that facility. So by the time you're finished training at LAX, you can work tower on either side. You can work any of the ground control positions. You can work the clearance delivery position. You can work helicopters, any of that. We're cross-trained to do all of that so that it doesn't matter who comes up the stairs. If I need a ground controller, the next person up the stairs, assuming they're not still in training, will fill that hole. And so, there's the advantage of anybody can do anything, but that also means that you're not doing the same thing all day long.
Right.
Yeah.
And you ask, most of us work 8-hour shifts. Some of us work 10, and just to be contrary, if you work 9. We are not allowed to go beyond 10 hours in a day. We're not allowed to go beyond 6 days in a week. So there are some limitations, just like pilots have crew duty time limitations. You might hear sometimes on frequency that a plane gets to the end of the runway or is taxiing out, and they're worried about crew timeout.
Yeah.
Because if they don't get airborne by such and such a time, the crew won't have enough duty time left to complete the flight. And there have been instances where they get to the end of the runway, and I've got, basically they've got 30 seconds left, and it takes that guy 35 seconds to get across the runway before I can say clear for takeoff. And too bad, so sad. We try to avoid that. They normally give us a heads up, hey, this flight is going to be, the crew is time sensitive. But, they're not the only airplane out there. And one of the ways that we work, and this is the beauty of not working for any one airline, and this is one of the reasons we do this, is that it's basically a first come, first served basis. And so, if an airplane needs help that way, we'll try and help them, but I'm not going to get everybody else out of the way just because this one airline can't, is having scheduling issues.
Right.
Remember, that's an extreme, case, but that's how we work. I mean, that's our primary function, and this comes basically right out of the book, is the safe, orderly, and expeditious movement of air traffic throughout the national airspace system. That is probably almost a direct quote from page 1 of our rule book. That was the official description of my job. That's what I do.
Yeah.
All the clear for takeoff and clear to land and taxi here and climb and maintain. That's how we do it.
Yeah.
But that is what we actually do.
How come sometimes we hear you for like maybe half an hour on North Tower, and then all of a sudden you're moved away, and you might come back, you may not?
Part of what we do is, one of the things about having everybody trained to work on everything is we try not to leave anybody in one spot for more than about 2 hours at the longest.
Okay.
But we aim for about an hour and a half, just so that you've got some wiggle room. But there's a constant sort of flow of people coming in and out throughout the day. At any one time, I mean, like right now, there's probably 8, maybe 10 people in that control tower. You'll hear some of them. Some of them you aren't hearing because they're doing something where they're not talking on the frequency.
Okay.
But we rotate through, so you work for an hour, hour and a half on tower, you take a break, you come back up, and generally you will go to a different position just for the variety.
Right.
And so that everybody stays proficient on everything. If
Gotcha.
you always do ground control,
Right.
and then one day you end up on the tower, well, you're going to be kind of rusty, not great. And vice versa. I mean, there are definitely people who prefer one or the other.
Right.
But the idea is that everybody is able to do everything. And so we rotate. And sometimes, because there are people coming in or there's someone who has to go home, the shift rotation is, okay, I need you to work over here for a half hour, then take a short break because I need you to come back up and send that person home. And I'm glad that's not my job, because I stink at trying to run the rotation and figure out, okay, I need to get this person out of, off position because they go home, but who am I going to replace them with?
Yeah.
And then you throw in something like training, where basically you've got 2 bodies that you have to treat as one, because you have an instructor paired with the student. And when they get off position, they have to have debrief time as well as a break. So that kind of, that's an extra cog in the rotation that you have to figure on. And they can only work certain positions, or they're training on certain positions, and all of that goes into the rotation. And so sometimes, and what will happen sometimes is that I'll be filling in a spot, and then someone who needs to be on that position comes back from break, and they'll replace me, and I will, we call it slide over to some other position where I'm still up there working, but I'm not where I was a few minutes ago, and I'll be there for, a half hour or an hour or whatever before I get to go on break. And so, but normally you won't hear somebody for more than about an hour and a half before they get replaced.
And those transitions, they're like flawless. You go from one person to the next.
We hope so.
Yes. I'm listening to you guys all the time. I'm like, wow, that was just flawless.
And what you're not seeing is how that happens, because the person who takes my place doesn't just step up and start talking.
Right.
They come up, they plug in, they're listening to what's going on, they're watching what's going on, and then when they think they're ready, I will actually give them a briefing. And this is not on the frequency, but it is recorded. Everything we say is recorded. And so, we have a checklist of, okay, this is the runway in use, this is what the weather's doing, these are the recent pilot reports on the weather, these are, this taxiway is closed or whatever, this airspace is closed or open, all that kind of stuff. There's a whole checklist of all the things we have to cover. And then, once they're sure, they say, okay, I've got it. And then they start talking, and I stay there for another couple of minutes listening and watching to make sure they have it and that I didn't forget to tell them about anything before I'm allowed to go. And so, it should be seamless. That's the whole idea, is that, you just keep on keeping on. And the voice changed, but we're still playing.
Yeah.
Almost sounds like a relay race. You
it
have to
is.
Be sure you're handing the baton and don't drop it.
Well, no, it absolutely is. And occasionally it doesn't work out. We made the national news many years ago when a controller came up and took over from another controller. And basically the first thing he did was put an airplane on the runway right in front of somebody who was about to land. And that had been part of the briefing, is that this airplane is on, and we talked about landing on the inboard runway earlier. This was a heavy jet that was going to land on 24 left.
Right.
And the airplane was about 1.5 miles final when he tells Southwest, runway 24 left, clear for takeoff. And Southwest rolls out there, and the heavy jet goes around. And it was close enough that it made the national news. And that's the whole point, is not to do that.
Right.
And so the 2-minute overlap rule came out of that, and some situations like that probably, where just because the other guy says, I got it, doesn't mean you immediately turn around and run away.
Right.
You have to stick around for a couple of minutes and make sure that he's got it, and make sure that, I forgot to tell you, that guy's on 24 left.
Right. But these are all things that, they taught you back in the 90s through those 9 weeks, right?
Some of it's you learn at the FAA Academy, because most of what they teach in that first 9 weeks was just, do you have a job? Mm-hmm. Once you have a job, then you do what's called terminal, in my case, terminal for airport, or en route for center, the guys who are doing in between, follow on, where, okay, now we're actually going to, you've at least made it through the next cut. So now we're going to teach you some of what you need to know, the basic rules, and then you get sent to whatever your first facility is. And that's where the learning really starts, because anytime you go to a new facility, it's just like pilots stepping into a new airplane. The training starts over, because the rules don't change. The airplanes still can't hit. That is, rule number 1, the airplanes cannot hit.
Right.
But how you do that at LAX isn't necessarily the same as how they do it at Long Beach, because the runways are different, the airspace is different, the terrain is different, all that stuff is different. And so how you do it here isn't exactly the same as how you do it there. And so anytime you go to a new airport, you go back into training on how to work that airport. Just like anytime a pilot transitions to an aircraft, he goes back into training on how to fly the Airbus. Because, the basic rules of physics don't change, for a 737 versus an Airbus, but where are the switches, what are the speeds you need to know, what are the procedures for, all that stuff, it's different from one to the other. And so you don't see pilots jumping out of a 737 and climbing into the Airbus for the next leg. Right. You don't see controllers working at LAX today, and then they go do Torrance tomorrow and come back to LAX on Friday. You work an airport, and then you work at that airport they fly a plane and they fly that kind of plane. You can transition, but you go into training each time. And
I think most people would say your job is probably one of the most stressful jobs in the world. Would you agree with that, or would you say?
That's one of the most common reactions I get.
Yeah.
And it's, oh, you're an air. Oh, that's such a stressful. I could never do that. Or isn't that such a? And we internalize the stress, but it's there.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't think about the fact that that Philippine that just flew over has 300 some odd people in the back of that plane.
Right.
If I take care of the plane, the people will be fine. But I'm, vaguely aware, there's 300 people on that plane.
Right.
And there's a level of, every time I say clear for takeoff or clear to land, I'm accepting responsibility for what happens, on that runway.
Right. And
that's not something taken lightly, because that has gone wrong at this very airport.
Right.
And it sounds easy. Oh yeah, just look out the window, tell the guy where to go. But, you can sit there and watch. I mean, you can come up and, you'll have somebody who's either in training or just visiting, and they plug in and they listen. It's like, oh, I could have done that. You tell that, okay, turn left, follow that guy, da-da-da-da-da. I could have done that. It looks so simple. But when it comes time to actually making the decision, okay, why is this one following that one? Right. Or why did that one go over there instead of over here? And you get into all the inside baseball rules of, this one doesn't fit over there.
Right.
Or that one has an open gate and the other one doesn't. Or any number of other things that go into it that, and a trainee a lot of times will ask, well, what would you do if da-da-da-da-da-da? And the answer is almost always, well, it depends. Because how I did it today while you were watching is not the same thing I did yesterday or what I might do tomorrow, because there will be some other variable that changes the outcome. And that's why we still have jobs. Because when ChatGPT can take over the control tower...
Oh, boy. I don't know about that.
Yeah, I don't either. But hopefully I'll make it to retirement before that happens.
All right, with all that going on, I mean, how do you, later Tater, how do you stay so calm up there? At least I think you're calm when we hear you on the live streams.
Well, part of it is that my microphone isn't on all the time.
Yeah.
So, But no, the truth of the matter is that a lot of it's basically training and experience. I mean, as I mentioned, I've been doing this for, a little while now. And so that's part of the training. And I remember my very first instructor telling me that, sometimes, the controller has to be the same voice in the room, because, I technically work for a regulating authority, and a lot of it comes down to basically, most of what I say is dictated by our rule book. There's a whole book of, situations and how we're supposed to handle them and the separation required, and this is the prescribed phraseology for this situation, and this is how you say it, this is what you say, these are the words. And through sheer repetition, you know what to say, and part of your training is, okay, this is how the situation looks like it's going to play out. But if something doesn't work, what are you going to do? And I mean, this is, as an instructor, this is something I ask trainees all the time. Okay, what if that guy doesn't do what you just told him to do?
Right.
And that's part of what we have to do, is you come up with the instruction, you give it to the pilot, and then you watch to see if they actually do what you told them to do. Because they don't always. I mean, they mean to, but sometimes they go left and you really meant right. Right. And sometimes you said right when you meant to say left. And that's all part of, okay, I have to come up with the instruction. I give them the instruction. The pilot reads back the instruction, which is my first check of, okay, did he get it? Then I watch to see, did he actually do what I asked him to do? And, what am I going to do if he doesn't? So you're going to have a plan B. And say, okay, well, if this doesn't work out, I can't get this guy out, then I'm going to do this other thing. And if that's not going to work either, then I've got, a plan C, and probably at least some vague idea of what plan D might have to be. where that normally comes into play is when you've got an airplane on the runway and an airplane on final for the same runway. You see this from time to time, and the idea normally is that one of them gets off of it before the other one gets there. That's the whole, we're not supposed to have multiple airplanes on the runway at the same time. There are some exceptions, but basically, you can't land and take off on the same runway at the same time. That's bad form. And we were talking earlier about the monthlies, and one of the runways is closed and construction and so forth. And what will happen is sometimes you'll put an airplane on the runway waiting for the arrival that just landed to get off the runway. And you're kind of expecting, okay, it's an A320. He's probably going to make this exit or maybe that one. And if he misses this one, I'm going to try and tell him to hustle down to the next one. If I can, I'm going to tell him before he lands, to try and make you'll hear this, if able, make the midfield exit or plan the midfield exit. Or we'll say, something like that, kind of lead the pilot. This is where I kind of like for you to exit. Sometimes you tell him, I don't want you to exit for, reasons. But you're just like, okay, he just missed that exit. Meanwhile, I've already put the departure on the runway. The next arrival is trucking down the final. Sometimes I can tell him to slow down. Sometimes I can tell him to make an S-turn. There are various tools in your toolbox, so to speak.
Right.
And sometimes one will work, sometimes another one will work. You can't do S-turns when they're way low. They don't want to do that. Sometimes you can change them, assuming the other runway is open. Sometimes you can change them to the other runway. You may hear this sometimes, change the runway 24 left. Runway 24 left, cleared lane. He was originally going to go to the right.
Right.
So, there are all kinds of options. And sometimes it comes down to go around, fly runway heading, climb and maintain 2000, traffic.
Right.
And you tell him about whatever the other airplane's doing. But you've got to know, what your options are. And you can't be so tied to one plan of action that you can't ditch it.
Right.
When it isn't going to work. And he's like, well, so much for that idea. Here we go with plan B. Or, well, plan B is looking, that's not going to work because whatever. How's plan C? I don't know about that. Plan D, here we go.
Yeah.
Don't know what it was, but here we go.
But stay calm while you're trying to figure it out, right?
Well, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the part about having your microphone turned off. But it really is loads and loads of experience.
Yeah.
And some of us are better at it than others.
Yeah.
But a lot of it's an act. Because that's part of I did have one supervisor tell me once, fake it till you make it.
Wise words.
Wise words up to a point.
Yeah.
But, air traffic control, that only works so far. At some point, you have to make it.
Right.
Yes.
And, but the whole time, I have to be able to project a voice of, shall we say, calm authority, because the tone of my voice is the only clue the pilot has as to what's going on. I mean, he can see, most airliners now have a traffic display where he can see what the other airplanes in the air around him are, but he doesn't necessarily know what they're all doing, and he may or may not be able to see the one on the ground, and so forth. But, and so, if the controller loses it, what's the pilot supposed to do? It's very much incumbent upon us to, maintain control of not only the situation, but ourselves. And sometimes that doesn't work out. I mean, there's not everybody who starts down this road gets to finish. Yeah. And that's one of the ways that occasionally people are invited to look into a different career field.
You definitely have a very calm demeanor, personality, but we all know that there are controllers out there that have kind of become popular in social media. Kennedy Steve. And,
notorious, I think is the word you're looking for.
Yeah,
yes.
Boston John. We're curious to know if you know any of those with the bigger personalities.
This is thin ice for me because we've had people like that here at LAX. Most of them have moved on, but this is not a thing where I want to really stick my neck out by speaking ill of other folks. That said, that's a thing that if it starts becoming a problem, your supervisor is going to call you downstairs. It's like, we need to have a talk. And one of the things we do as controllers is something called tape talks, where just because you're not in training anymore doesn't mean you don't have to listen to tapes of yourself. And so there will be times where you and the supervisor or the training specialist sit down and listen to a tape of you working traffic. And there will be a critique of, okay, you're using, that sloppy phraseology or incorrect phraseology, or you should have said this, and you said that when that's not the correct phraseology, or, you dropped the call sign here, stuff like that. And so there's and sometimes it's more like, okay, you need to go listen to yourself. And get back to me with what we're going to do about this. So I mean, it's not like you have free reign to just do whatever you want on the frequency.
Right.
Now I'm curious to know if you ever go back and watch our streams and listen to yourself.
I will admit to having done that once or twice, mainly because that's the easiest way. It's like to replay a situation at home. At work, we of course can replay. We have radar replay.
Right.
We have the voice radio replay where we can, and not just us. I mean, somebody at headquarters can dial up and say, well, let's see what's going on at LAX today, and sit there and listen in and watch the radar and say, what's going on over there? And occasionally you'll hear back that's like, well, there was an inspector who listened to you on ground one the other day, and you need to stop doing this, or you did a good job doing that. But the easiest way at home is it's like, oh yeah, I was working that day. That's how Tater Tot found out that he's Tater Tot.
Well, now let's hold the phone here, because I'm sure some people are listening to this and they're like, well, now hold on a second here. Why is he called Later Tater?
Well,
I mean, it kind of wraps up to what we're talking about
does,
now.
Actually.
On one live stream, I heard you. I didn't even know who you were. You just said Later Tater to someone.
To someone. I don't remember who it was. But it's some airplane, some random airplane. American 266 contact SoCal departure. Later Tater.
Right.
And just being totally just kind of flip. And apparently somebody was listening. Thus, here we are. And
so Later Tater, you also see y'all.
Oh, absolutely, y'all.
Y'all.
So I don't know how to do it in.
Aer Lingus.
Aer Lingus. Yeah, Aer Lingus, and I
was going to say, guess
Welsh,
that plane.
but it's a way to. I would say add levity, individualism.
Yeah.
It's definitely something that I have to be careful about, because there's a time and there's a time not.
Right.
And I mean, if you listen long enough, you'll hear situations where all of a sudden, okay, we're not screwing around.
Right.
I mean, none of it can be screwing around.
Right.
But there'll be times it's okay, that needs to stop right now because I've got serious business to attend to.
Right.
You'll never hear me say, howdy y'all by Air Force One.
Right.
You just don't.
But I think there's a calming effect to the pilots.
There is a calming effect.
And everyone working.
Because my grandmother said way back in the way, you catch more bees with honey than vinegar.
Mm-hmm.
And and so that's part of the. Because I've been the other guy on the radio, and you get better results if you're kind of upbeat, if you're not being mean or disrespectful to the pilots, which we're not supposed to be, but
or condescending. I've heard a little bit of that.
Condescending. That's a very good description of it. But it's particularly when you do this day in, day out, and it's like. You get tired of the same mistakes over and over again. It's like, man, I wish he'd just listen. And so it's very easy to become that person. And I have been that person. And it works better if you're not that person.
Yeah.
You just And
That's not what I said.
Well,
I've heard
and
a little bit of that.
Yeah, you probably have heard some of that.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I got here, way back in the day, 2002, 2003, and was training, at that time the attitude was somewhat different than it is now as far as what's acceptable for how the controller addresses the pilots. But one of the techniques that I remember being taught on ground control was that if you were having a bunch of difficult interactions with pilots, you jump on one of them and everybody else jumps in the line.
Yeah.
And
because they're all listening, right?
they're all listening, or they're supposed to be. That's sometimes the issue, is they aren't listening in the first place. But that tool gets dull really, really quick. And so that's something, you want to use that very sparingly, because it gets old for them too. And it's like, oh yeah, this guy, I got that guy. And and it's a lot easier at the end of the day if you haven't been unpleasant to basically everybody on the frequency. It's just, I find it less nerve-wracking for myself. And because sometimes I have to work next to somebody who's having one of those moments, and you kind of cringe. Mm-hmm. It's like, I've been there, but geez, I wish this was over. And a lot of that comes down to the experience, and that can sometimes be a tell for like a supervisor running a shift that, wait a moment, so-and-so doesn't sound the way they normally do. Maybe I need to pay attention to what's happening over there, because that's part of what the supervisor's job is to kind of ride herd on everything. And sometimes that means that your break comes up a little sooner than it was expected to, because maybe you need a break now.
Right.
And sometimes it just comes down to, and sometimes it's just a matter of somebody stands next to you and kind of helps. Just pointing out this airplane, that airplane, or this strip, or whatever. Not even to the point of taking over the position, just kind of being a second set of eyes and ears. And a lot of times, about half a dozen transmissions is all it takes to fix the situation. But you can get so buried in your own mess that you can't see the forest for the trees. And then somebody comes and gets you out, and they issue half a dozen control instructions, and it's all over. And it's like, what just happened here? And that's where one of the things about being a controller is that there's a certain, I don't want to say arrogance, but there's a certain level of pride that you know what's going on and your poop don't stink. But you have to be able, at a moment's notice, to swallow that.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, this ain't working.
Yeah.
And sometimes what it takes to fix the situation is more than what you are able to do. You need somebody else, because it's not in your airspace, or that airplane's already left your frequency. You've got to reach out and say, hey, departures, can you turn that guy because this other guy's doing a thing? Or you yell across to the other tower controller, I need to turn this airplane, or can you hold off on your airplane for a moment because I may have to turn this airplane? That kind of stuff. Sometimes it takes someone else to pitch in. And again, normally, 30 seconds later, it's all done.
Right.
Again, my grandmother, if you mess up, fess up, and then fix it.
Right.
You've got to, if you screw up, people screw up. We're human. We try not to make mistakes. We really do. But if you make a mistake, you need to know how to fix it.
Right.
And you better do that. That's also part of what we do. And if we do it right, no one ever knows.
Yeah. So there seems like there's definitely a lot of personalities up there in the tower. You've got later Tater, who's with us here today. Another name we pop up, Tater Tot, who the audience described as, I guess, a younger version of
A
later
younger
Tater?
Tater?
Tater Jr.
I don't even know if that's even true, but that's what they
Well,
came up with.
We used to work together a lot. Actually, we don't work together that much anymore. The schedules were on different crews, so we kind of pass in the hallway type thing most days. But Tater Tot, as he told me after seeing it on one of your videos with his kids.
Yeah.
But yeah, Tater Tot is another controller who's been at LAX for a decade and something now.
Wow.
Honestly, I mean, he's been around. He came here, I think, from Burbank. He was at Burbank before. I could be mistaken, but.
And this is contact departure.
Yeah,
1.75.
Yeah, and but yeah, he learned he's Tater Tot by your video popped up in his YouTube feed one day as a suggestion, and he's at home and he's like, "Oh, hey, I worked that day," so he watches the video and at the part where he comes on. And his kids are watching with him, and y'all say something. Oh, this is the guy we call Tater Tot. So now his kids and his wife know and call him Tater Tot.
Tater Tots. Oh boy,
and,
that's too funny.
Oh
Love
yeah,
it.
it's so. And yeah, well, I mean, and at this point, we're as you mentioned, we are not supposed to be personalities, and so I'm kind of pushing the limit on that sometimes. I have occasionally had a supervisor kind of, hey, you need to back it off.
Yeah.
But just if you listen long enough, you recognize voices after a while.
Oh, right.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
different people say different stuff different ways, even though the phraseology itself is fairly prescribed. Runway 24 left, clear for takeoff. That's how you're supposed to say that, and we all do. But you say it slightly different ways, different accents,
Right.
So forth.
Right.
And it's like, hey, I heard that guy yesterday, and the pilots get it too. I think sometimes where the ones that fly through here regularly, and some are based here, kind of familiar voices. And I actually had a tug driver lay a later Tater on me a few days ago on ground control. And it's like, hey, wait a moment, that's my line.
Wow. Yes. Yeah, I mean, it seems Buttercup. Apparently you've never met. Ops
I have
90.
never met Buttercup, and that was just something that was just totally off the top of my head.
We enjoy those interactions, though, when we listen and you say, "Hey, Buttercup."
And and it's all in good fun.
Yeah.
While remaining professional.
Right.
And again, there's times I say, okay, I can't play around right now because there's too many other things going on, and too much of that it becomes a distraction, or it can be. It's not supposed to be. I mean, there's a big emphasis on no distractions in the tower cab, so I can't watch your stream in the tower cab because YouTube is blocked on FAA computers.
Right.
Because you really want your public servants using federal bandwidth.
Can I ask you, are we on the TV in the break room?
Probably, and of course, people can watch on their iPads and cell phones and all that sort of thing.
That's good to know because sometimes we'll spot like a Mylar balloon and we'll say, "Hey, tower," but they're not watching.
Well, and pilots will often report balloons, but we are no, YouTube is not playing in the tower cab.
Okay.
We're not allowed to have cell phones in the tower cab. I mean, just not at all. And that can be a disciplinary offense because we're supposed to be looking out the window.
Right.
That is what we're there for. And I mean, you see enough people playing with their phone on the freeway. It's like the phone will not steer the car.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a focus towards staying focused on what you're doing. And you talked about stress earlier. That's one of the things that can become stressful because you've got to stay focused. But sometimes you need to stay focused on more than one thing. And humans like to think that we can multitask. We don't actually multitask. Multitasking is jumping back and forth really, really fast.
Yeah.
But equally stressful sometimes is staying focused when there's nothing to focus on.
Right.
When you've got one airplane or two airplanes And it's very easy to get involved in a side conversation or, whatever. And, all of a sudden you look up and it's like, oh dear.
Yeah.
And we really try to avoid that. But the tedium of staying focused when there's not that much going on is one of the reasons that we do rotate people in and out, because, you want people fresh. And I've observed, particularly when I'm training somebody, that about the first hour and 20 minutes, they're good. And then after that, things can start going downhill pretty quickly because they just start running out of steam. And, part of the training process is building up your ability to keep going safely, even though you've been there for an hour and a half. But that can be dangerous if you can't stay focused on what you're doing. And so, we rotate people through to try and keep people fresh. And, we'll call it a freshen up sometimes, where, I need you to freshen up so-and-so. Yeah. And
on that note, I'm kind of curious to know how many screens you're looking at one time.
Oh, boy. The tower cab looks like a Best Buy. There are screens basically everywhere. And most of them are duplicates. We have a radar display that shows the airplanes in the air coming to and from the airport. We have another radar display that shows the airplanes moving around on the ground. We have another display that basically shows the assigned gate numbers that the airplane, and it looks similar to the ground radar display. And sometimes in a pinch we can use it as a backup because it uses a different information source, but it tells you the gate numbers. It's not always right because, gate numbers change, sometimes last minute, and the pilot knows. Sometimes the pilot doesn't know. There are at least three different screens that show us, weather. A lot of it's duplicate weather from different weather sensors. We have screens that show basically all the important information you need to know. It changes on a regular basis. What is the current ATIS code, which is the automated recording that the pilots listen to that gives them basically the current weather, the visibility, the wind, the cloud cover, the runways in use. But it's also a place where we list, what's closed today, what equipment is broken, or, what airports are having some sort of flow program where we're running delays to Vegas or we're running delays to Phoenix or here or there. Right. Because, you need to know that so you don't get the guy out to the runway and it's like, oh, wait a moment, he can't go. Holy cow. There are probably some other things I've forgotten. That's most of them. Sure. And, like I said, there's a lot of duplicates, but at any one time, you may be scanning back and forth between the airborne display and the ground display because the airplane on the runway doesn't appear on the airborne display anymore. They drop off at a certain point. And so you've got to hop back and forth. Okay, there's one rolling out on the runway. Where's the next one on final? Do I have time for the first one to get off before the second one gets here? Do I need to send the second one around? Is the departure rolling? Or, is he still sitting there? Is that guy clear of the runway yet? We'll tell somebody to cross. And, this airport isn't that big, but it's still big enough that, particularly at night, it can be difficult to see if an airplane at the far end of the runway has finished crossing the runway. And you don't want to, have the next one land or depart if he's still sitting, sticking his tail out on the runway. All of that is stuff. So you're jumping back and forth, or the supervisor will announce, hey, ATIS Alpha is now current. So you need to glance over and say, okay, what does Alpha say? Because, Alpha is, we change it at least every hour, but something will have changed. The wind's different, the cloud cover is different, a runway closure changed, whatever. And so you've got to look at that. There's new flow programs. When does that flow program end? And, all that stuff. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff that you're kind of alternating back and forth to try and keep on top of. And at any one time, what you need to see is on some other display. So, yeah.
It's a lot.
It's a lot of displays. Basically, you look at the tower cab and you see that ring of windows that go around the control tower. Imagine basically a shelf right below those windows all the way around, and it's nothing but monitors all the way. I tried to count one time, and I lost track, somewhere around 60.
Oh my!
And there were
goodness.
more. I just couldn't remember. Did I count that one yet or not? And so, and then some certain positions have other stuff they're looking at. Flight plans, for instance. I don't have to look at the flight plans, but the clearance delivery controller does. He's got 2 screens for that, plus the weather and the delays and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's no end of displays to look at.
Wow. I'm overwhelmed just hearing all about it.
Yes, I don't even know what to talk about. I mean, what is your favorite out of all the positions up there? What is your favorite? North Tower, South Tower, ground south, ground north?
It depends what day it is, actually.
Yeah.
Because there are times that any one of those positions is a cakewalk, and there are times that any one of those positions is a meat grinder.
Yeah.
The south ground control is consistently the toughest as far as the most likely position for stuff to just get crazy, because there's the south ground control, what we call ground 1, controls basically all the taxiways on the south side of the airport. And sometimes we can divide it where what we call ground 3 will actually take some of the west end and some of the stuff on the south side of the airport, so that ground 1 can look at primarily just the terminal complex. But part of what the ground controller has to do, you've got taxi to the runway, taxi to the gate. How hard can that be? Well, one of the first things that you learn as a ground controller when you go into classroom for a ground controller, earlier I talked about drawing a map. Ground controllers, the first thing they do in classroom is, okay, here's a blank map of the airport, label every gate, all 100 and some odd that we've got. Yeah, label every taxiway. And because the ground controller needs to know, how do I get to that gate?
Right.
And in the case of a lot of the core terminal gates, who controls that gate? Because we don't. United Airlines controls a couple of the alleyways. Alaska has one. American's got a couple on the north side. Delta has a couple alleys. Most of the Tibbet and the midfield satellite is the city ramp tower. And so an airplane calls me at gate 134, that's not my gate. So and you've got to pay attention to where he is. If I tell him pushback approved, I was like, whoa, that's not my I don't know what's there. It's not my it's outside of my area of jurisdiction. And but also an airplane lands and he's going to gate 134. Well, how do I get him there?
Right.
And you've got to know all of that without thinking. And so that's one of the challenges for a ground controller right off the bat is, how do I get him there? And also, before I get him there, is that gate even open?
Right.
Because if the gate's not open, I don't want him anywhere near the terminal complex. I mean, we don't have a lot of room to work there. And somebody who can't get off the taxiway just becomes a real big thorn in your side. And so, it's a rock in the stream or whatever you want to call it. And so normally it's like, okay, how can I get rid of this airplane? And sometimes you can go park them somewhere.
Yeah.
Sometimes things are busy enough that you can't park anybody anywhere, because the moment they park, they're blocking that taxiway,
right,
which means no one else can use it. And so...
Now, we heard you one time say, you're off to the beach. Your gate's not ready. You're off to the beach, which is going to the far
basically
west side.
The west end of the airport.
Right.
And, there is a beach over there. We can't actually see it because it's on the other side of the dunes.
Right.
But,
some of the pilots know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, you look at the chart and say, okay, well, the land stops right over there.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a beach, Dockweiler Beach. There's a state park there. You can go camp there if you like. It's really, really noisy.
Yeah.
And the crazy part is, you look at that, and there used to be a neighborhood right there.
Yeah.
Back in the 20s, 30s, 50s, 60s. I think it was called Surf Ridge. But there were houses on top of those dunes.
Yeah.
And if you take off out of here, particularly off the north side, and you look out, you can see the streets are still there.
Yeah.
All the houses are gone, but the streets are still there. And it's now, of course, a nature preserve for the blue butterfly. And they have since discovered, I think, 2 other endangered species that maybe weren't there to begin with, but they're there now.
Interesting.
And so, that's... But, the west end of the airport tends to be where you're more likely to be able to put somebody and let them sit for a while.
Right.
If you're watching on the south side, you'll hear the tower controller, tell somebody, taxi via hotel, whole shoulder taxiway, Quebec, or sometimes Bravo 17, which is as far west as you can go on that taxiway. And, at that point, they're a mile and a half from the terminal. But, if the pilot just told me, well, my gate's not going to open for 30 minutes, fine.
There's obviously a lot of construction is going to be had here at LAX in the coming years.
Yes.
Additions of many new terminals. Is that going to cause even more stress for you guys? Or?
I'm sure it will.
Yeah.
We've seen preliminary sort of layouts of where the terminals are going to be. There's going to be this parking lot right here in
Terminal
front
0,
of us,
yeah.
which is currently the Uber lot, and that's going to become Concourse 0, which is going to have wide-body gates. That's wide-body gates,
Wow.
I believe.
Oh.
Terminal 9 is going to be where the American Eagle terminal is now. You probably see that from the
Right.
H Hotel, where the American Eagle guys are now. That's going to become Terminal 9.
Right.
Believe there's going to be wide-body gates there also. And then American Eagle Terminal is going to move down to next to where the American Maintenance Hangar is now, basically at the south end of the MSC, is what they originally called the Midfield Satellite Concourse. It's now the West Gates at Tom Bradley, I think is the official name for that building.
That's where the Eagle's Nest was originally, wasn't it?
A long time ago,
Yeah.
when I got here way back in the day, yes,
Yeah.
the Eagle's Nest was there.
Right.
At the time, that was Taxiway Sierra, I believe, that ran north-south, and Taxiway Quebec that ran north. It was two parallel taxiways. At the time, we controlled it. We have a control tower. Controlled that. Then the airport, they built the new terminal, or concourse, and we also got new north-south taxiways to the west side of that. And so the airport took over the midfield north-south taxiways because all the gates on the west side of the Tom Bradley push onto that taxiway, and all the gates on the east side of the MSC push onto one of those taxiways. And so they control all the pushbacks on there. If an airplane has to go down one of those taxiways from the north side to the south, they work it, or we at least have to call them and get permission to run an airplane through their airspace, if you will. And we control the taxiways on the west side of the MSC. They're November and Papa currently. That's been one of the, if you talk about stressful things for me, having been here so long. A lot of these taxiways used to be called something else.
Wow.
And every now and then I'll have a flashback moment. It's like, oh no, that's not Taxiway Quebec anymore. That's actually Taxiway something something. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, so old dog, new tricks. So, that is a thing, and that's going to happen again. I think we mentioned earlier, Northside Construction, they're going to build new taxiways to exit 2-4 right or 6 left that replace, in some cases, the ones that have now, because right now there aren't that many exits on the north complex. 2-4 right, which is the runway we land on,
right,
primarily on the north side. There are not many ways to get off that runway, and so we're going to get a couple more sort of high speedish. I don't think they're going to be official high speeds, but they're not going to be 90-degree turns.
Okay.
And they're also going to build a couple on the east end for landing on 6 left, because when we go east traffic and we have to land on 6 left, there is no easy way to get off that runway when you're landing on 6 left. There's, if you miss the midfield exit at Yankee, which is pretty early for, arriving airplanes, you're stuck with 2 90-degree turns, and, you've probably sat and watched, a 777 or a 747 making a 90-degree turn, and it takes a long time.
Yes.
And because, it's a big airplane.
Yeah.
And, meanwhile, the next arrival keeps coming, 2 miles a minute, 3 miles a minute. And, as a result, when we are east traffic, we cannot run as many airplanes in an hour as we can when we're west traffic. The airport's just not built
I was just going to ask you about that. I think we could probably do a whole podcast on East Flow, reverse ops, as we tend to call it. Is that is that a nightmare for you guys? Just absolute, just like, oh boy, here we go.
It's, for some people it is. I have to admit, I kind of look forward to it because we don't do it very often. There are years that we don't do it at all because it's totally weather dependent. We won't do it if we can get away with not doing it.
Right.
The airport just is not built to go east traffic. It's going to get better. It's going to be a couple years from now, but it's going to get better.
Right.
But the arrival rate at this airport goes down by about, if I remember right, 15 or 20% if we have to go east traffic.
Right.
And so delays at LAX will domino, across the country. Picture a pond and you throw a rock into it and you just watch the ripples go out. And so you'll end up with airplanes sitting on the ground in JFK because we're east traffic. And we just can't land as many airplanes.
But that's because of the taxiways.
That's primarily because of the taxiways.
Okay.
So it will get better.
Okay.
And it needs to.
Yeah.
Particularly since, if you watched this winter, we were east traffic more than we've been in recent years by a good little bit.
Right. And
it appears that the global climate change situation means that's going to be happening more often in future. So, and of course, we're trying to get ready for the Olympics. Los Angeles is hosting the Olympics again in a few more years.
Right. And
we expect to be really busy for that. And so a lot of the construction you see now is strictly in preparation for that. I mean, that's the goal, is to get it all done by the time the Olympics happen. And, I hope we make it. There's a lot going on.
Oh, yes.
Well, speaking of the future, what's the future for you here at LAX?
I go to work tomorrow.
Oh.
Well.
Yeah. Tomorrow is Monday in my world. Which,
oh, boy.
By the time you listen to it, may not be. But most of us at LAX are currently working 6 days a week.
Okay.
We are, on paper, fully staffed. But some of those people are still in training, and so we're having to cover some while they get up to speed, which is normal. But in the meantime, we're working long days, and it looks like this is going to be a busy summer.
Yeah.
So fortunately, I've already got my vacation time scheduled.
Oh,
good. There you go.
But you're. I mean, the retirement's in your future.
Retirement
correct?
is in my probably not too distant future.
Yeah.
Because one of the other things about being an FAA controller is that we have mandatory retirement when you turn 56 years old. You get to work airplanes to the end of that month, and then you're done, unless you get a waiver. And I am currently operating on a 1-year waiver to continue. So I have until the end of January coming, and then we'll see. It's possible they'll ask me to stay beyond that point, but it's not guaranteed. One of the little pieces of fine print when you're doing that is that I am basically on probation for the entire time because I'm beyond my point of mandatory separation. And so, if I start going downhill or screwing up or whatever, they basically say, okay, you're done. Bye. Thanks for playing. So, that's something to kind of keep in mind is that, it's a shorter leash than it was before your birthday. But
when that day does come, what are you going to do next? Sounds like you still want that stressful,
the possibilities.
Possibilities. Puzzle. I got to
busy, right?
solve a puzzle.
Well, I've got a neighbor who told me that before you can retire, you have to have 7 hobbies. And I'm still short a few, so I'll have to start working on that. But I've always assumed that there would be something else. Don't know what, but retiring at 56 or 57 or even 58, it's like, that's, given today's average life expectancy, that's, what am I going to do for the next 20 years, potentially?
Yeah, right.
I don't know.
Are there places that maybe you would like to visit that you haven't been to yet?
Oh, so many places. I've never been to Australia or New Zealand.
Really?
would really like to go. Thing is, it's so far away that you don't go for a weekend.
No.
You go for, I mean, and even a week. I mean, you go and you're just trying to get, you spend the next couple of days just trying to figure out what time it is. And then it's time to get on the plane and go back home. And then you spend several more days trying to figure out what time it is.
Yes.
So that's not something you do lightly.
Yeah.
There is the possibility of employment in Antarctica, which is hilarious considering how much I don't like snow. But it would be something, I mean, it's one of those things that's like, man, that would be awesome to do and awesome to see. I've seen the Northern Lights, never seen the Southern Lights. So, I mean, there's probably easier ways, but... You know,
that would be amazing.
You know, but yeah, I mean, there's so many, I mean, and there's so many places, to be honest, here in Southern California that I haven't been, and so many things I haven't done because I have to go to work.
Yeah.
And, you know, that is, I'll admit, one of the downsides of being a controller is the work schedule. And this is the same for commercial pilots. You're going to be working on the nights. You're going to be working on the weekends. You're going to be working on the holidays because that's when people travel.
Right.
And so, you know, I've got 30 years in, and yet I've worked nearly every Christmas and nearly every Thanksgiving. And that's, you know, that is one of the, you know, one of the catches to doing this. It's a great job, but, you know, there's a level of responsibility there. And part of that is that, you know, you've got to work the nights and holidays and weekends because that's when stuff happens. I mean, this airport, airplanes are flying 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. More during the day than not, but if you're out here at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, there's still stuff happening. Not as much, but it's still happening enough that we can't all go home.
Right.
So,
as you get closer to retirement, do you ever, you know, look back on your career and think of maybe a memorable moment?
Oh yeah, most of them. I won't say most of them, but you know, there's a fair number that you kind of would be happy not remembering. But I've been very fortunate. I have never had to listen or watch somebody die in an airplane.
Oh, good.
I've had to listen to tapes of pilots whose day was ending very badly, but I've never been the one on the other end of the radio as it happened in real time. And that's always kind of been career goal number one, is to always be somewhere else when bad stuff is happening and never make the news.
Yeah.
So far, you know, I've worked airplanes that did not end well, but it happened somewhere else, somewhen else, and not in my, on my frequency in my airspace.
Yeah.
I have watched things happen to airplanes, but everybody was able to get out. So, you know, that's good. Yeah, it is good. Yeah. I mean, it's not. You know, I would never wish that on somebody because, and you know, I don't know if, you know, I'd be able to come back if I was ever there and, you know, was the one listening as, you know, something happened. But, you know, that's part of the responsibility you take on is, you know, you're there. And sometimes, you know, you need to be that voice for the pilot. I mean, we talked about earlier about, you know, being able to project a calm, commanding presence. And that's part of it. I mean, there have been times where, you know, without going into details, but there have been times where I've had to talk a pilot down. Not here, not recently, but I've had to do that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I like to think that any other controller would have done the same. But still, there was a point that day when the outcome was in question. And thanks to, you know, my training and experience, you know, everybody went home that night.
Yeah.
And honestly, as a controller, if I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, you don't even know I'm there. I mean, the pilots know I'm there, but as, you know, the flying public, you know, what I'm doing, you know, if I've done everything right, you don't even know I was there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my goal. Is, you know, everybody gets to where they're going, and, you know, they go on because, you know, they're going somewhere for a reason, not just so that they can hear me talk. I mean, y'all accept it, but
it's amazing to hear everything that goes into this job and everything that you do. It's very impressive, and
Well,
thank
well,
you
thank
for
you.
everything
Yes.
that you do as an air traffic controller here at LAX.
Absolutely.
Well, it's a great job. It's a great responsibility, but it is a great job. And thanks for having me.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely. This
My
is
gosh.
amazing. Wow.
Well, you're going to make a lot of people happy. This has been the number one thing. When you going to get Later Tater on the podcast? When you going to get Later Tater on the podcast? Well, here it is.
Yeah, now
Yeah.
it's like, when will you get him to shut up?
No, this has been like, am I dreaming right now? This is really happening.
Well,
and
yeah.
wow, thank you so
Anytime
much.
you want to come back, you're more than welcome to come.
You'll be sorry.
No, this has been incredible. Thank you for your time, and thank you again for joining us today.
Oh, it's been awesome. Thanks a lot.
All right, well, this has been so much fun. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in and listening. I have been Plane Jockey Kevin alongside Plane Jockey Rudy.
Thanks again for having me. This is great.
Of course, the man of the hour here today, Mr. Later Tater.
Hey, thanks for having me, y'all. Thanks for listening, y'all. And remember, later, Tater.
Oh, boy. See ya all later, Taters. See ya on the next Plane Jockeys podcast.
Goodbye.
Well, folks, we finally made it. That's good, because the first officer and I have talked so much, I feel like I know him better than my brother.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Plane Jockeys Podcast, a companion to Airline Videos Live.
Goodbye.
Find us on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Airline Videos, or visit airlinevideos.com. On behalf of the entire crew, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again on the next Plane Jockeys Podcast.
Bye-bye.